All right, welcome back. So we're learning here about Yutes Kislev. It's coming up and very, very soon. We got to get ourselves ready. What's that?
What are we celebrating?
What are Yutes Kislev celebrating?
Yes, all right, I'm not down.
You got to get down. This is the liberation of the Alter Rebbe from prison and the birth of Chabad Chassidus, basically. It's the 19th of Kislev, the Thursday. This Thursday, we're going to have a big Fabring and everybody's welcome. That's when we start the Tanya again. It's called Chag HaChagim, the holiday of all holidays, Rosh Hashanah of Chassidus. Okay, so we started to explain a few things. If you recall, we're talking about these two stories, right? The one about the Alter Rebbe being visited by his Rebbes in prison, and then we went back a generation about the Rebbe, the Maggid of Mezrich having a similar story where he was also put in danger to the spread of Chassidus. And we said that in that case, there's the Alter Rebbe himself, which came up with the mashal of the prince, that his life needed to be saved. And we asked the question, why was the Alter Rebbe once again in doubt when he was put in prison if he should continue to teach Chassidus, because he was teaching so much, when he himself came up with the antidote to his Rebbe just a generation before by bringing out that mashal of the Evan Hayakara B'Keser HaMelech. Yes, remember all this? Good. Then we went forward and started to explain what actually is going on with the prohibition of Kabbalah. Why is it usher to begin with, right? And we started to explain that really it's not a prohibition on the chefza, which is the object with which you do the mitzvah, i.e. the Torah of Kabbalah itself. There's nothing wrong with it. But rather there's a limitation on the gavra, those who try to learn Chassidus, right? It could create danger for them because they're not a proper kli to be ready for it. And we gave a few examples and knowledge of different times in history. People were harmed from trying to learn these teachings to the point that it's recorded in the Gemara. And in fact, the prohibitions are recorded in the Mishnah, the Gemara, and they're brought down also in the Rambam of all the limitations and conditions that are required in order to learn this teaching. However, we said there's a proof that there's nothing essentially usher about the Torah itself. How do we know this? From the Rambam himself, who explains that at the end of days, the Jewish people, when Mashiach comes, will all be Chachamim Gedolim, Yodim Esasumim. We're going to know all the secret matters, and not only are we going to know them, but the whole world will be occupied with nothing else but the knowledge of their Creator alone. So obviously, when the conditions go away, which make it dangerous, we can see that the Torah itself is completely permissible and good. Right? There's nothing that requires it per se to stay secret. Right? But we started to explain that nonetheless, in the generations before Mashiach comes, we have to put these prohibitions on it, and yet we find that even before Mashiach comes and the prohibition is completely removed, we found that the Arizal came along and said, Mutter mitzvah lagalos zos hachma. He came along and said, we're allowed to learn this wisdom. And we started to explain that even in the time when it's still prohibited, nonetheless, there are certain heterim, certain leniencies which enable us to learn this information. And we left class yesterday by explaining that we basically find ourselves now, I'm going to leave that in the parentheses because now is a little bit of a debatable time that we're in. But let's just say, before Mashiach comes, right, where the learning of Kabbalah is still strictly prohibited, but why are we allowed to do it? Because we're relying on certain heterim. And we left off yesterday, what are those heterim? All secrets of the Torah.
Any Kabbalah, but Chassidus is okay.
No, Chassidus also is under this category of being prohibited, and we're learning it only because we're relying on a certain heter.
And the exact heter.
We're going to get to. That's what today's class is about. Someone had a question? What's that? Yeah, so we're going to see there's two heterim, right? Look at page 172, the second paragraph down. Aval b'duros acharonim, in these later generations, mitzvah legalos dos hachachma, it's a mitzvah to reveal this wisdom. Limros hatanaim b'hagabalos, even though there's all these limitations in the halacha. And the Rebbe says, Yesh Lomer Bei Shnei Biurim. There's two explanations as to why. And they're basically two heterim that we just spoke about. Aleph, Al Derech Mashakasuva Rambam, V'Sicha L'Sifro Mor HaNevuchim. This, the first one we can understand by Rambam's opening of his sefer called the Guide for the Perplexed. Right? So that he writes a little introduction over there. Shetam Sheksav Sifro Zeh, and he writes, why did he write this book? Sheyeshbo Inyanim Nistar. He explains there that there are hidden matters. It's a deep philosophy book, and it goes into all kinds of mysteries and angelic ideas and so forth and so on. And he writes there that there's secret ideas in there. He says, however, and he quotes over there this verse, which is, and it comes from a Gemara in the end of Brachas, where it says there's a time to do for Hashem, we have to destroy your Torah, right? There's two ways of reading this, of course. One is the simple reading, which is get up. We have to do something for Hashem because they destroyed your Torah, right? In other words, because your Torah is like in jeopardy. Come, we have to stand up for Hashem. The other one is this kind of wild reading that sometimes you have to do something for Hashem. What do you have to do for him? You have to destroy the Torah for Hashem himself. And the Rambam writes this as he's writing out these pages of Mor Nevuchim. He's basically saying, I'm destroying your Torah, but I'm doing it for you. And why? Because the Jewish people were in a state of perplexed. That's why he writes the Guide for the Perplexed, which the Jews at that time were extremely perplexed. It forced him to reveal secret mysteries in order to save these perplexed ones in matters of faith. Famously, he wrote this book in sort of the style of the philosophy of the day, which had captured everybody's attention and was like kind of getting them lost, which is the Aristotelian, logical and basing morals on logic and so forth. So the whole thing is very much based on this logical type of analysis. But wouldn't you know, he comes to all the conclusions that the Torah comes from. So he basically walks the perplexed through their perplexity in the way that they were accustomed to being perplexed, and he sort of winds them up with the right ideas. Very, very, very complicated work that actually perplexes you more if you try to read it today. But in those days, I guess it worked. He says, so in the same way, this is essentially what is the heter for revealing Chassidus in the late generations. It's the getter of Eis Lasos Lashem Eferu Torasecha. It's the same idea, basically. You're not allowed, but it's actually called destroying the Torah. But at the same time, there's a time to do it. We have to do it for Hashem. The great descent of the spiritual level of Jews in these later generations. The hearts, became smaller and less soft and able to experience true sensitivity to godliness and to truth. Became mitzad. Matzav ha'olam b'chlaluso, and not only just the Jews, but the whole situation of the world, right, is rushing into all kinds of new, fangled, and dangerous ideas. And the evil started to mount in the later generations in like a sort of an unstoppable snowballing effect. It forced basically the Rebbeim, starting with the Arizal, really. It forced this information out of them because they had no other choice. Penimius Torah had to come out, which is moreres as hakochos hapenimim hanistorashim nishmas adam. Why was the secrets of the Torah sort of the antidote to this issue? Because just like inside of the person, you have a chitzonius and a penimius. What is our chitzonius? It's our logic, our what we call the revealed powers, basically your sort of conscious self. You also have a penimius. You have your inner neshama, you have your pintel yid, your core, which is this believer. We're called, the Jewish people are called ma'aminim, b'nei ma'aminim. We're just believers, we're the children of believers. There's something deep inside of our DNA that could just sacrifice our lives for Hashem if we have to. We inherited this from our forefathers, but it was sort of lost on us. We weren't tapping into it. So revealing the penimius of the Torah, it triggers the penimius of the yid. And therefore, we're able to suddenly meet the challenges of the day because the Pnimius Torah aroused our neshama to be able to stand the test of faith, of this intense evil, both intellectually and just sort of in the world that had overcome everybody. It gives us the help and the support that we need to overcome the darkness of the galus mibachutz, outside, that is very dangerous to be a Jew, and on the Minias Mimrifnim, and also what's holding us back inside, which is all of our confusion of modernity that's leading us astray inside of ourselves. Not just that there's oppression, anti-Semitism, is that we've gone lost. This order ba'avas Hashem v'yiraso, and this Torah of Chassidus, it arouses us for love of Hashem and fear of Hashem, la'avdo b'leiv shalem, so we can sort of return ourselves to serving Hashem with a pure heart. Of course, we've talked about it in the past, different moments when this idea of Eis lasos la'Hashem heferu terasecha has come up. What's the famous example that we had to destroy the Torah in order to preserve it? Yeah? Right, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi wrote down the Mishnah, right? So this was a no-no. You're not allowed to, the written Torah, there's a law, it has to be only written, you can't say it Baal Peh, and the Torah is Baal Peh, you're not allowed to write it down, you can only say it Baal Peh. Comes Rabbi Yehuda, he says, I have to destroy the Torah. All the Torah we have today is based on, similarly, a heter, right? Every Gemara that you pick up and you read from, you have to understand that this is based on a heter. Really, you're not supposed to be doing this. And the same is true if you trace this all the way back. I like to point out that this is Moshe Rabbeinu himself, right? He literally broke the Torah in order to save the life of the Jewish people, right? And Hashem told him, right? Yashter kochacha asher shibarta, right? That, in other words, he approved Hashem, so to speak, because at the end of the day, if the Torah is going to stand in the way of the actual life of the Jewish people, that's not what it's there for. It's there to reveal the Jewish people, not to choke them and so forth. So if the Torah had these powers to save our lives, even though it was prohibited, this was the original heter to teach Kabbalah that we could be saved. But there's a second heter. Base. We find certain things that come in the Torah as called a preparation for the days of Mashiach. And the Rambam himself indicates such an era, right? You can find this in the Rambam in Hilchas Malachim, when he's talking about the end of days. He writes that not yet quite in the time of the Geula, but right before the Geula, he says Eliyahu Hanavi is going to come, liyasher Yisrael achin libam, in order to sort of straighten up the Jews and to prepare their hearts. And then he actually says over there, it doesn't necessarily have to be in the form of Eliyahu Hanavi, but there's some kind of a period there where it's not yet Geula and it's not yet Galus anymore, and it could be sort of symbolized by the coming of the prophet Eliyahu, and it's going to straighten up the Jewish people and prepare their hearts. It's for the days of Mashiach. So v'kol shekein b'kal v'chomer shekein tzriich lios b'nogea li'inyanim ha'ikari shem mos Mashiach. And if that's true that there's going to be a period of preparing us for Mashiach, how much more so when it comes to the main thing which characterizes the days of Mashiach, which is what? Quoting the Rambam, Lo nisavu chachamim ba'navim yimos Mashiach. Why do the prophets and the wise men desire the days of Mashiach to begin with? Only for the sake kadeshu panoim b'torah v'chachmasa. So they could learn, right? Did they desire the wealth and all the money and all the bounty? That wasn't really their thing. They were waiting for a time when we wouldn't have all the enemies and distractions, so that they could focus 100% on learning the Torah and His wisdom. So if there's a time which is going to prepare ourselves for the coming of Mashiach, then obviously the main preparation which has to happen is in the main quality of what Mashiach is, which is learning the Torah and its wisdom. In other words, that we have to prepare ourselves to be reaching that pinnacle when the Rambam says when Mashiach totally comes, we're going to all be occupied in the knowledge of our Creator all the time and nothing else. So therefore the preparation time for that has to sort of mirror it. What does it mean we have to straighten up and prepare our hearts? It means we have to have Pnimius Torah. So period, this is a second heter, right? What is the first heter? essentially what we call pikuach nefesh, right? If the Jewish people aren't going to make it, therefore we're going to permit them to have access to this reality that's going to keep them alive. And the second one has nothing to do with pikuach nefesh. The second one has to do with the fact that we are nearing the end of days, and you can't just pop into Mashiach's times without preparing yourself. How do you know? Because the Rambam indicates this period of human history which precedes Mashiach's coming in order to prepare us. And therefore, there's suddenly another heter on the table that we are allowed to learn Kabbalah and the secrets and mysteries of the Torah, should you happen to be in that period of history when you're allowed to learn Kabbalah now as a preparation for Mashiach's times. Right? It's another heter. The Rebbe, I just was learning a Sicha. The Rebbe says another sort of indication besides this Rambam, which is more like Alpi Nigla, is that there's, of course, this idea that we're living in the 6 days of the week, and the seventh day of Shabbos is also the 6,000 years of creation, and the final 7,000 years Geula. So therefore, there's also like a remez that you're supposed to taste something of the Shabbos meal before you go into Shabbos, right? The delight and the delicacies of Shabbos, you have to sort of like have at them before Shabbos comes. Also, we stop saying Tachnun before after Chatzos on Shabbos, and we start to put on our Shabbos clothes. So there is, halachically speaking, sort of an entrance into Shabbos mode before you actually get to Shabbos. And the same thing is true here when it comes to preparing for the understanding of Mashiach's times. You have to already enter yourself into Pnimiyas HaTorah, which will be the primary occupation of Mashiach's times. You have to sort of have an early go at it. And therefore, there's a special heter to learn Kabbalah should you fall in those days. Fine. So when it comes to the difference between the two reasons why you're allowed to reveal Kabbalah, what are the two reasons? Pikuach nefesh and preparation for Geula. So there's also, therefore, two ways that you're allowed to reveal it. In other words, depending on which reason you are using this heter for, there's also a different measure and manner of the Kabbalah that you're allowed to have access to. Al derech shnei ofanim b'nigla the Torah, Mishnah u'Gemara. And if you're going to give an example, what do you mean that there's two different ways of, so to speak, accessing the Kabbalah? So he says, I'll give you an example from Nigla, that you have something called the Mishnah and something called the Gemara, and they're both called Torah, but they're totally two different ways and manners of accessing the knowledge of God, right? And therefore, in comparison, the two different heterim, whether or not you're learning Kabbalah because it's a pikuach nefesh situation, or you're learning it based on the fact that you're in the days preparing for Mashiach, you're also going to be able to learn the Kabbalah and the Chassidus differently, either in a Mishnah format or a Gemara format. So he says, Aleph, Gilu pnimis haTorah ba'ofen sha'ikar hi yedias nekudas ha'inyan b'kitzer al derech lashon ha'Mishnah shu davar ktsar v'kolil inyanim rabbi. Right. So the Mishnah manner of learning Torah is basically that you should just know sort of the idea in a nutshell. Right. You ever learned a Mishnah? You'll know that it takes maybe several pages, sometimes a dozen pages or more of Gemara to actually unearth all the secret little, extra pieces of information that are coded inside of that Mishnah. But when you learn a Mishnah, you still grab the whole thing. It's called, as in the Rambam's language, it's called a davar katsar. It's a short statement which contains many, many, many statements. So in other words, you get the point, but you don't get all the arichos and all the sort of luxury of really understanding the point. But the point you get is that there's an ending just to learn Mishnayos, right? You can learn the whole Torah just by learning through the 6 orders of the Mishnah. And do you know the whole Torah? Yes, you can honestly say, I've been through the whole Torah. I know every law, right? Only what? When you're going to start opening up the code of the Mishnah, you're going to realize it's going to take you an entire lifetime to actually learn what it is inside of those little points of Mishnah that you had. But nonetheless, the Mishnah is it in a point. But then you have this expansion of the Mishnah, which is called the Gemara. And it's called the Giloi Ba'ofen Mavur Musbar Bar Chava. It's having the same information, but in a way where it's explained and at great length. And this is like the Shakla V'Tarya in the Gemara, right? You're not just going to take a point, you're going to go discuss it for 3, 4, 5 pages, break your head on it. And this is what we've been talking about in the previous Sichas, what's called Yisparnasun. What does Yisparnasun mean? What's that? To be nourished, right? To take it in like Parnasa. So we said that ultimately the Rashbi had intended, this is what we learned in the last Sicha, the Rashbi had intended that this information shouldn't just be spoken, but should be written, and ultimately be written down in such a way that it would go and be found by all the Jewish people, not just the small, group that he revealed it to, and then ultimately it wouldn't just be known by the people, it would be known in a way of Yisparnasu. They would actually understand it. And this is basically a promise from the Zohar that eventually we would have these secret teachings in a way of being totally expounded on, not just by points, like the Mishnah. And he says, do you guys have this page, by the way? Yeah. So those who explain the Zohar, right? He brings a few different mafarshim of the Zohar below in the notes. The Hainu, what does it mean to be mi'is parnasun? It means those godly matters can actually truly be chewed up and digested and understood. Not like someone who learns begirsa, where he just sort of covers ground, and if someone's going to stop him and start asking questions, he wouldn't really be able to answer those questions because he hasn't really digested it. He just could have swallowed the pill, right? Sha'az halimud begeder parnasa. When you break it down, understand that it's called parnasa, as it says in the Tanya, right? That through learning the Torah, heite ve'iyun sichlo, when you learn it well with the whole depths of your intellect, ad shenis parnes besichlo umisachedesimo, the point that your brain basically starts to truly get nourished from it, like a good idea will actually light you up and sustain you. Right? If you just hear like a nice pithy vort, it can kind of give you a good feeling. But when you break it down and you actually grab your mind around a piece of information and you understand it, it's like a machaya. It actually enlivens you. And to the point that that's when you can actually become one with it, right? Like you said, if you swallow something whole, it's going to kind of come in as it went out. But if you break it down, digest it, then the whole idea is that food actually becomes blood and fats in your body. You become one with the entity itself. So to Torah, if you break it down, it nourishes you. You become one with the Torah, and it becomes what's called mazon lenefesh, right? It's like we usually say that mitzvahs are called garments, because you can't really ever understand a mitzvah. Mitzvahs are sort of just deeds and not even in the realm of understanding. You go ahead and perform it, and so you don't really grasp it with your mind. But Torah is intended to be digested, eaten, so to speak, so it's called mazon lenefesh. Now the Rebbe brings a little brackets over here, which actually, where does this brackets end? A little down the road. Yeah, on the next page. So this is like he breaks us into a little side point, which is interesting. He says, Yesh lomar, shebezeh yesh letavech divri admar zaken odos limud chachmas hakabbalah, shenirim kesosrim l'chora zeh et zeh. He says, with this in mind, that there's a Mishnah and there's a Gemara, and there's two different ways of approaching the Torah, and also Pepinimius of Torah, he wants to make sort of a peace between two seemingly oppositional statements of the Alter Rebbe himself in two different places where the Alter Rebbe seems to contradict himself. On the Chazal, he says, "V'kein nifsak lahalacha." The sages said, and it's also brought in the halacha. He says, see the Rambam Shulchan Aruch over there, and the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. Shechayev adam l'shalesh zman limudo. Shlish b'mikra, shlish b'mishnah, shlish b'talmud. A person has to divide up their learning into three, right? So there's a question about how you do this, whether you do it like sort of in your life, the beginning of your life. You're supposed to just, when you're a child, learn a third of your life, just the psukim and like master them. And then as you go on later, you start with the Mishnah, and then at the last third of your life, you learn Gemara. So there's such an opinion like that, but then we say, but you might not ever get to it. The Mishnah and the Gemara. What if you don't live long enough? So then they sort of said, no. What it means is every day, you're supposed to divide your day into three parts, a third in Mikra, a third in Mishnah, and a third in Talmud. Why we don't exactly do it like this, I don't know. But this was sort of like the ancient way. It's brought down in the Shulchan Aruch. This is how a person is supposed to intend to fix their time. The Alter Rebbe goes over there and he says actually that once you get your third in Mikra down, because you do that, then you can spend less time on it because you sort of have it well. Yeah. Did you want to say something?
Would it mean like metaphorically, you would spend a third of your time on the way Mishnah learned, like you learn kind of this broader idea, and then you take a third of your day and learn something more in detail versus actual Mishnah Mikra?
So I want to say yes and no to your question. He's basically going to the rest of what he's about to say here is a yes. But what he means is that it also means kipshuto. In other words, it is Mishnah and Gemara. The only question is what's called Mishnah and Gemara exactly, right? As we're going to soon see, for example, where does Kabbalah fit into that, right? So, but nonetheless, it's not only metaphorical, right? It's that you're supposed to learn Mishnah, Mikra, Mishnah, and Gemara, and that's basically all there is ultimately, right? So everything would fall into that category. Okay, but the question comes out. Right? The Alter Rebbe writes in Hilchos Talmud Torah. So in those very laws that we're describing, the Alter Rebbe writes about the laws of Talmud Torah. He writes that Chachmas HaKabbalah Chashe Bichlal Shlish Be Talmud. So we just asked, where does Kabbalah fall into this category of Mishnah, Mikra, Gemara? So in the laws of Talmud Torah, the Alter Rebbe says that learning Kabbalah is like learning Talmud. In other words, right? It's this depth of knowledge of deepening your mind and understanding at this broad level. Psak Rambam, and he brings this from the Rambam's Psak, Pardes Bichlal Gemarahem. Because the Rambam himself says those things which are in the realm of Pardes. Pardes really means Pshat, Remez, Drush, and Sod, but Pardes actually winds up becoming sort of like a symbol for the secrets of the Torah. Like it says, four that entered into the Pardes, Rabbi Akiva and his Chaverim. So even though the Pardes is like Kol HaTorah Kula, but it really comes to mean like being Matayil in the Pardes, as the Rambam says, that these secret matters of Torah are, as opposed to someone who's eating their bread and like their bread and their meat and potatoes, which is like Nigla, the Rambam calls the Pardes, the orchard. It's like when you have a little dessert. You're going to go walking around and tile and grab a fruit here and grab a fruit here. It's like YTD, right? So the idea is that the Rambam calls these secrets of the Torah the Pardes. And therefore, the Alter Rebbe writes that those are compared to, or they're part of, I should say, the Gemara. But hold on a second. In Likutei Torah, which is not the laws of the Alter Rebbe, but the actual Chassidus of the Alter Rebbe, he writes there in a Shakla V'Torah al Derech HaNigla, right, in his normal way of niglaizing Chassidus, he writes that Limud HaZohar B'Kisvei HaRizal Hu Bichlal Shlish B'Mikra. He says no, that the learning of the Zohar and the Kisvei HaRizal, where do you put that in your day? You should put that in your morning hours, the third of the day. You're going to learn Mikra, just the Psukim, right, and not in Gemara. So what you have here is an argument between the Alter Rebbe and the Alter Rebbe, right? What is Kabbalah? Where does it fall out? Is it considered Talmud? Is it considered Mikra? And he says both. And he explains why it would be called Mikra, which is just simply reading verses. Sharei Midrash HaZohar hu al Psuke HaTorah. Right? First proof that he has is because if you go through the Zohar, it's all based on the verses, right? You go through the Zohar Bereshis and Shmos, Vayikra, so it's basically just going through verses of the Torah, so it's Mikra-like. V'od shegam b'limud razin d'oraisa einu masig rak hametzius. And furthermore, he says, for the similar reason that it wouldn't be part of Talmud, this is because you can't really understand it. Now, he doesn't exactly say you can't understand it. What he says is you can only understand the Metzias. What does he mean by that? Yeah. What he says, when you're learning the secrets of the Torah, you can only grasp the Metzias. What does he mean? As opposed to the Mahus, right? What's the difference between Metzias and Mahus? Taka. What is the difference between Metzias and Mahus? Anyone know? We come across these words every single day in Chassidus. Which one is which? The mahus is the essence. Let's agree on that, right? Mahus comes to the word mahu. What is it? Right? It's essential thing itself. Metzias comes to the word, of course, we know to be found, right? It's found. So the metzias of something means that it is found. So the idea is that when it comes to, for example, physicality, right? We can say that we know the mahus of it, right? But when it comes to spirituality, we don't know the mahus of it because no one here has ever shaken hands with an angel or talked to one or seen one. You only heard about it. So you know that it's found, that it is, but you don't know what it is. When it comes to spirituality, right? The angels have the opposite. The angels, they know the mahus of spirituality, but they never saw anything physical before, right? They can't enter into the domain of physicality. They heard there's a physicality. They heard we got the Torah down here. There's such a thing as called the physical world. They know that it is found, but they don't know what it is. So the Metzias is basically that it is, but not what it is. I know about it, but I don't know what it is. So when it says that, when it comes to, why does the Alter Rebbe want to say that the whole Kabbalah should be placed in the realm of Mikra, right? He's basically saying because you don't really understand it. You're just like Mikra, which is essentially something. Here, look what he says the next line. Ke'ein limud mikra. Why is it like Mikra? Because Mikra, who quoted b'shmosav shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Because really, when you're learning Mikra, you're just reading the names of God. Who can say they really understand these words? And I'll tell you the reason why you can be sure that you can't understand it, because someone who comes and tries to understand it without like the ready-made, packaged oral Torah of the Jews that tells you what all the words mean, you go and make many other religions out of this book, right? Because you can't understand what the 5 books of Moses says without any explanation, because it's not even intended to be understood. Like everything that was, is, and will be before creation, after creation, it's all in there. It's just like the name of God inside of this book. Can you really say that you know what it is? No. So when you're reading it, you're only ever dealing with sort of like grasping for straws, and you don't really have it where you can sink your teeth in and say that you know what it is, right? It's just like you're reading the names of God. You have no idea really what's hidden inside of these words of the Chumash. And so says the Alter Rebbe there, that this is kind of very similar to reading the words of Kabbalah. Right? You can look at it, but it's like reading God's name, and whatever it's talking about, you might know that it is, but you'll never be able to sink your teeth into it and like actually grasp it and know what it is. So therefore, he says it should be put there in Mikra. So now we've got a full-blown machloikis, basically. What is it? The Alter Rebbe says in one place that the Pardes is compared to Talmud, and he learns this also with the Rambam. Here he says it's Mikra because you can't understand a word of it. How do we understand this? Tomorrow. Okay. Yeah, works out well.